History laid the foundation
that informs our conversation. Welcome to the classroom.
From the church to the streets, and even in the suites, and all around the world. I'm gonna keep it real in the classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom. Fannie Lou's classroom.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Fannie Lou's Classroom as we have kicked off season 6 and we are now well into our third episode. I'm super excited about the conversation we're going to have on today. We have always, as we do always from week to week, some amazing guests on today. But first, I always have to give a major shout out to those in the background that make this happen from week to week. And so Cheryl is not in the space right now. She's on her way. We want to always give a shout out to Cheryl, who makes sure all of our guests are well taken care of, whether they are virtual or in person. Then, of course, we have Ashley, who handles all of our social media. We appreciate all that she does to make sure that we stay well informed, but also that we are posting and having conversations between Thursdays where we can have ongoing conversations around issues that are important to us. And of course, we have to always shout out Brooke Mosley, who makes sure that all of our engineering is on point, our sound, our video, and all that good stuff. She's an amazing team member as well. And so I'm going to just jump in and introduce our guest on today. My good friend just walked in. You see, we prayed you right on in. I had it in my mind. And I said he'll get here just in time. So I'm excited about today because we kicked off season 6 really in light of where we are in this nation and really the world. We started off with this episode, Joy as a Witness, how joy becomes a tool of resistance in light of all that's up against us and all the existential crises that we find every day that we wake up and we find something new. And then we shifted to what does it mean then to have a conversation as it relates to the African diaspora. How we talk about some manufactured but real tension that exists within the diasporic community, the African diasporic community, and how we really need to, how do we look at the ways in which we build power and we see what sounds cliche, but true, that there is unity in our diversity, right? Where we're not trying to all be one thing and what it means to be Black. Black is an experience that looks different based on where you are. And even where you are, that varies. But what does it mean for us to see where we have commonalities and come together? Because we think that's important this time that we are in, as we look at deportations, as we look at what's happening in the Congo, in the Sudan, still in Haiti and other places. And so we thought it'd be, good now to have this expanded conversation around what does it mean to have faithful solidarity and mobilizing the global majority, because we are the majority when we think about demographics globally. We are the majority. And I know Karen Hunter, Greg Carr, always talk about this on In Class with Carr on Saturdays, and even have Garb, right? What I call Garb for the movement, where you get a T-shirt, you can buy a T-shirt or a sweatshirt, it says global majority. And I think we have to lean into that so we can see that we do have the power to, really make this a more just and equitable world. So super excited about the conversation on today. So today's focus is going to be on faith-rooted activists and scholars committed to collective freedom and liberation. I guess I could say about everybody on this podcast today that you're a scholarvist, as Dr. Ivor Carruthers would say, that you combine the scholarship with activism, which is so needed. And I always talk about the ways in which the academy and the church need to do more collective work together, that we need to learn, not be afraid of one another. And that there's a benefit in that. So let's just jump right in. Let me introduce our amazing guests on today. First, we have Sara Singha. Sara is originally from Karachi, Pakistan, and is a scholar of comparative religion and politics. She received her PhD from Georgetown University in Islam and Christianity and a Master of Theological Studies from Emory University, where she focused on the challenges between religious freedoms and the U.S. constitutional law. Sara's research focuses on marginalized and persecuted groups in the global South. She writes extensively on discriminated and impoverished communities in India and Pakistan, and has taught courses on post-colonial theory, Islam, modernity, and social empowerment. Let's welcome Dr. Singha to Fannie Lou's classroom.
Eris, it's really a privilege to be here, and I look forward to our conversation. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. So I hope we have a great dialogue today. Thank you.
You're welcome. And then next we have our good brother. Now, is he, Angelo, have you been elevated to Deacon Reverend? But we have, just messing with Angelo.
He's on his way.
I'm just messing with, so we have Angelo Martinez. Angelo, why does it have A on here? And I thought it was Angelo. Angelo Martinez is the manager of Nonviolent 365 Education and Training and the manager of faith-based relations of the Better Together initiative at the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. His professional experience is rooted in social work. After obtaining a Bachelor of Social Work degree from Florida International University, Angelo worked within the Department of Juvenile Justice and faith-based organizations serving under-resourced and migrant communities throughout educational empowerment programs. While attending the Chandler School of Theology at Emory University, he worked within the Georgia State Prison System under the chaplain's office. Angelo holds a Master of Divinity with a concentration in justice, peace building, conflict transformation. He's a published poet and spoken word artist. Well, go ahead, Angelo. Let's welcome Angelo to Fannie Lou's classroom.
Yes, thank you for the introduction and the energy that you brought to that. And I'm just thankful to be here and just echoing what Dr. Singha said, have meaningful, fruitful dialogue for today's topic and discussion.
Yes, we had a poet and spoken word artist last week. My good friend Asmira Hamari Davis was on here last week. So she didn't mean to, but because that's who she is and some of her responses, she rapped some of those. So Angela, I'm gonna look for you to slide that in on some of your answers today. And then lastly, we have my good friend, my brother, my friend, Pastor Dameon Madison. He needs really no introduction. He is a former co-worker and co-laborer here at Friendship West with me. But certainly we continue to co-labor together in this work. But I'll just say Pastor D is a native of my favorite city, Chicago, the Chi, and he possesses a heart for humanity and social change. And for as long as he can remember, this has been his call in life. And so having worked with both the church and nonprofit areas, he is committed to community engagement and development, life transformation, organizational development and administration, and individual education and empowerment. Concerned with bridging the gap between our intellect and inspiration, the cultural awareness and social formation, passion and community solving. And I always have to give a shout out that he's a graduate of Talladega College because we love our HBCUs and we can continue to pray and support our HBCUs even in this moment. Pastor Madison graduated also, he attended, I'm going to say it, he attended Liberty University Baptist Theological Seminary, and received a degree in church leadership, and it shows. And we know you have done so much other reading to go along with that. So just give a shout out. We want to welcome Pastor Dameon Madison to the show, and his full bio, you can read that in the YouTube. If you go to the description, you can read more about Pastor Madison in that bio. So let's just kind of jump right. Well, let me first do this. Let's do a quick round robin, right? And talk to me, just tell me your vantage point, your view on, let's just level set. When we say it is important to really find this solidarity among the global majority, talk to me, just tell me why you think, just on a foundational level, why is it important that we do that? Why is it important in this moment that we really seek to connect with this faithful, to build faithful solidarity with the global majority? And anybody can jump in. I won't point at anybody. Whoever wants to go first can go first. Okay, Dr. Singha.
Why do we feel a sense of community with the global majority?
Why is it important that we have a solidarity well, one, how we see ourselves as a global majority, and why is it important to then build solidarity in that?
I think it's necessary, especially as communities who have experienced injustice and who have some experience with injustice. So either we work in a field where we are familiar with the topic and we know what the issues are, we know what the dynamics of injustice and persecution and marginalization look like for other communities, and we are familiar with the language that's used and the issues that arise, or if we've had personal experience with those things in our lives, I think it's necessary that we have a strong sense of solidarity with communities all over the globe who are either currently experiencing those things or that we see red flags and that they might experience those things. I think that it's imperative that we use our voices and speak up, and that we assist those communities who we feel are going to go through those issues, whether we've had personal experiences with them or whether we've had academic experiences with them, or perhaps even theological experiences with how these things work in terms of familiarities with biblical narratives and things like that about persecuted communities and communities that require social justice assistance, God's assistance, and in the contemporary period, people who need political assistance and social assistance with simple things like food and water, and then greater things with being uplifted and assisted because these are abused communities or have the potential to be abused communities. I think it's a moral imperative that we do so. And I think that without that type of solidarity, we don't really have a society and we don't really have a community, but we have sort of disparate people who are living together and they are not here to assist each other. And I think it's extremely dangerous and leads to a very, very pronounced sense of nihilism.
I think in addition to that, and that's a very powerful response, is also, I think it's important because it gives us a picture. And I think this podcast discussion is a prime illustration of that. I mean, we have Dr. Singha, you have Angelo, you have yourself, you have me. And so and each of us have different experiences that come from different parts of the country, parts of the globe. And so one of the things that I think that we suffer from in our current climate and our culture is this idea that we center America in everything. We tend to center our personal experiences and our limited exposures, and we expect and we begin to kind of define the rest of the world by our experience due to an exposure, which again creates ignorance and so. But if we can create solidarity across the globe, we begin to understand that marginalization, oppression shows up across the globe. We see that racism shows up across the globe, that oppression shows up across the globe. And so if we can have those conversations where we recognize that it's just not an experience that's happening here, but it happens everywhere. And so as faith leaders, we have to work together to help kind of navigate and begin to work together better by seeing that this is not just a me experience, but this is a global us experience. And so I think that's why it's important for us to have, again, engagement, solidarity, understanding, learning from lived experiences even, while we begin to see how the globe looks outside of our own space.
Yeah.
And I would like to expand on that because I think even solidarity can be a resistance. Shared lived experiences can help us signal in one part of the country, whether it's political oppression, they're seeing signals in another country, the same rhetoric, the same symbol. So that knowledge is also a shared resource. That shared lived experience is a shared resource. So I think also solidarity has levels of resistance when you are matched against, like I mentioned earlier, political situations or theological, cultural violence, conflicts, whether it's land resource based or it's just over ideology. One feels more superiority, like how Pastor D mentioned, like we center one's ideology, one identity over another. The shared experiences, like a perfect example, those who resisted apartheid. How is that solidarity for those who were here during the 90s? Calling for the end of apartheid, even in the late 80s. And then you have Gandhi, his resistance. How did that influence Dr. King? And then you also have like other countries who've had nonviolent tactics how did that influence other countries? And how did that, like their tactic, did that influence this tactic? Now it's a shared knowledge, it's a shared lived experience. So I think solidarity in itself can be a form of resistance, depending on how we disperse and engage each other through the knowledge, through lived experiences. Especially in today's climate, I think it's much needed. With the solidarity, the need for solidarity, and how we experience other perspectives, lived experiences, especially if we're all foreign to each other. Some way, somehow, we're all foreign to each other. Come from a different country, we've experienced a different country, visit another country if you're a tourist. We're all foreigners in some way, also. But there is a sense of solidarity, and I believe that can be foundational to resistance.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about, Fannie Lou Hamer, who once said, whether you have a PhD or no D, whether you went to Morehouse or no house, like we're all in this bag together. And I think kind of leaning to what all of you have said, what I'm hearing though, this sense of solidarity is this idea of collective action, right? This, or if we're seeking, it can be collective freedom. I would say collective liberation is what we need to be after. And so let's just kind of start there too, right? So talk to me about what would you, in this interconnectedness, that we are interconnected and that we can't get away from it. So there's no such thing as separation, right? And if we think about borders as man-made, and they're political, right? We know borders are also political. And what does it mean even to extent not to see borders as they are, like how we really see ourselves as human. So let's talk about what would you say are some of the principles of collective freedom? And I'm going to switch it out to say collective liberation. Yeah. What would be some of those principles?
So since we have 3 folks on here from the King Center, I'm going to have to go here and drop this, and then I'm sure Angelo or Sara will pick up with it. One of the things that we have to step back and recognize, and I'm going to start with this thought in my mind, is that Dr. King is revered and lifted up as a global human rights leader, right? And part of that is because out of his philosophy of nonviolence, are these 3 I's: the fact that we are all interdependent, interrelated, and interconnected. Mm-hmm. And so we, and its idea is born out of the world house, the fact that we are all part of the world house, right? And so we are all caught in this inescapable interconnection of experience, and so I think we have to be able to, begin with that idea that what happens to me here, and I think that, again, and we've all heard this quote, injustice, anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere, everywhere. And so, so if we just pause and just sit with that for a second, the fact that, what happened in the East can also happen in the West. What happens in the North can also happen in the South. And furthermore, I think we even saw this when Dr. King visited, the Midwest and went to Chicago, and he saw that racism looked different in the Midwest, and again, my home city, Chicago, than in the South. But it hit him so hard that, he was in his hotel room for days wrestling with, okay, what did I just see? This thing right here is deeper than I ever. And so, because again, it may look different, it may show up different, right, but it's interconnected because it's all tied to a system, an ideology, a way of thinking, a belief system, that there are people who should be subjugated, that there are those who are less than, least than. And we're seeing that very same thing play out now. And I'll pause on that for a minute. And so we're watching how all these things intersect. Mm-hmm. And so we have to, again, sit with that and recognize that is a beginning point and an ending point.
Mm-hmm. Angelo, Dr. Singha?
Angelo, you can go ahead. I'm still processing what Pastor Dameon said.
Yeah, I think one of the pillars of that foundation is the interconnectedness, the three I's, interrelatedness, understanding that one, skill sets, diversity of skill sets, a diversity of talents, diversity of lived experiences, one contributes to the greater whole. I don't want to say greater good because there's some historical harm that comes with that phrasing, but we have to understand like we all contribute to this society, how we want it to run, how things like that, even when it comes to social structures of what to say, what not to say, things like that, or what is considered harmful and not harmful. So even as we look at a society, a community, and how interrelated we are, we start developing these social norms. And then we also have to recognize some of them are harmful and some are not. And then we also have to interrogate it. But it kind of shows you the power in the system and the structure that can be built when we recognize, hey, you can create shirts, you don't have the platform to distribute them. I do. So let's work together on that piece, and then what does that look like economically? What does that look like when it comes to empowerment and representation? So I think when we engage the interconnectedness, interrelatedness in this world house, especially on a global view, like for one, we have to tackle the barrier in the sense of, well, that country's that country. That's a distant neighbor. Like I don't see them. I don't communicate with them. I don't know their struggles. But they might be going through some political oppression right now. But that's not on my shores. That's not on my seas. But then it's like, well, slowly it's taking over. Now we have some fringe conspiracy theories that are making mainstream here. That's echoing that same rhetoric in another country. So I think we also need to understand how we are interrelated on a lived experience point of view, on an economic point of view, on a spiritual theological point of view, because again, one's experience in another country, there is a dominant faith tradition, and they come here, they might expect that same dominant faith tradition to be practiced, but then they're hit with other faith traditions with different views and different perspectives. And that could be a shock to them. So we also need to like kind of really see one, the barriers of this world house interconnectedness, but then also even in that interconnectedness, there's power. There's a sense of, okay, let's discuss this. Let's bring light to these blind spots and expose kind of how can we move forward together and not in a harmful way, but minimize harm, minimize violence, but to engage the diversity of all that in a healthy, communicative way.
Thank you. Dr. Singha, you still processing?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think what Angelo said is right. And yes, we need to have solidarity with other communities. I think it's extremely important. It is how we're going to have, I think, long-term sustainable peace, and why and how we're going to have any type of collective freedom or an understanding of collective freedom in our physical reality. Because otherwise we can just keep things conceptual, and we can talk about collective freedoms, we can talk about freedom in general, but if we want to make things grounded in our physical reality, I think that we have to take some steps to actualize these ideas and to really bring them into our physical lives by taking action steps and changing policy and doing things that really empower people and uplift people and make them aware of what their legal rights are, so that they can be conscious when their legal rights are being trampled on, and they can start making changes. As Pastor Dameon said, that is part of the world house, if the world house is going to be something strong and not just something that's theological based or spiritual based, I think.
Can I chime in here
Yeah,
too?
for sure.
And to both of those points, and I love how Angelo even mentioned the idea of how we view barriers, or borders as something that's kind of far and distant. I think one of the things that we have to be able to do as we look at and wrestle with, world house being interconnected, being interrelated, is this idea of being neighborly, right? And so, and we think about this idea of our neighbors as somebody who is in our immediate sphere of influence, someone now that, who thinks like us, who lives near us, who has the same standing economically as us. And so we kind of parse these things down to what we can control conveniently. But so I think as we look at how we navigate globally, how we have collective action and collective moves toward liberation and freedom globally, I think we have to really shift our thinking of what it means to be a neighbor. We have to move from the idea of neighbor being a concept geographically, but one that's moral. How do we view our neighbor? Who is our neighbor? And broaden that concept and that perspective that it's not just who I see, but it's everyone in my sphere. And so it's a moral concept where if I hurt, you hurt. I have a bracelet that's, it's a Ghanaian bracelet. And has two alligators on it, and they're both sharing space. And when I bought it, the guy made sure I knew what it meant. He said, that means if you eat, I eat. Then we all eat. And so there's an idea of being interconnected. We are interrelated. So if I win, you can win too. But also, to answer the point earlier, if I'm drowning in oppression, you are too. And so I think, so I love when you began with Fannie Lou's, her quote. She understood that despite, your training academically, despite your pedigree, despite, we all can experience oppression the very same way. And so if we come together and be collective and recognize that we are up against a overarching evil.
Right.
Right. We wrestle not against, right. So we're up against something that's strong, that's powerful, and we have to have a collective movement to deal with this thing because it's big.
Yeah, man, there's so many ways I can go with this. One of the things I want to say, though, because what I heard all of you saying, a thread that I heard everyone saying, and I'm going to kind of even go further back with language. I think this is where this African worldview of Ubuntu, even Ubuntu being really more of a modern, we know Nutu was the root of that, that the ancients used long before we have what we call the Hebrew Bible in our New Testament, right? But this idea of what it really means to be human, how we honor that divine spark in every human being. Because to me, that's what's lost in the world, that this human hierarchy that has been developed and that has really permeated even societies that once before that was not the way in which they understood how they ordered their society. It's that William Augustus Jones, right, that I use my anthropology to dictate my sociology, then I throw a little theology on top of it, right? And so I feel like just fundamentally, if we're going to have this faithful global society, we need to answer the question, what does it mean to be human? Because what tends to happen is that, and it happens we see it now in America too, right? The ways in which, as long as I might be other, but as long as I'm above the other, right? And that's kind of what tripped people, even with these mass deportations, right? As we saw what I'm gonna call certainly the cultural wars that started taking place, where people are like, well, that's not my problem. You weren't there for you weren't there for us. That kind of thing that went back and forth. And even how you had some people saying, I didn't think he was talking about me. But it was okay when he was talking about somebody else. And I think we have, to your point, it's this overarching power structure. It's what I call it white domination. I don't use the language of supremacy. Because one, fundamentally, is nothing supreme about whiteness. Because to me, it continues to reiterate that there's this hierarchy, and as Eddie Glauber say, we have a value gap on people's lives here in this country, and it spreads throughout. So I think for me, fundamentally, how do we really begin to show people that we are all in this together in terms of the global majority, and that we're fighting, to your point, this overarching evil. So we have to be able to, I can look and say, okay, yeah, you're challenged here. This is how the oppression looks where you are. It may look different where I am, but it's the same oppression nevertheless. And I think somewhere here we have to break down some barriers, right? And I think to Angelo's point, which you also highlighted, was that we have to begin to see neighbor as a moral center, right? That we start there to say, if you're human, you're my neighbor. And just dispelling this whole myth of borders are man-made and political anyway, right? So I think as we talk about the global majority, I see that as one of the things that we have to really reclaim. That we have to answer that question, because if I can see anybody as fully human, then I'm not going to look and say, well, or we're not going to have a oppression wrestling match that mine is worse than yours, et cetera, right? That it's all the same, it's all harmful. So I guess with that being the case, because rooted in that, once we can get past and understand that we are all human, that we all are having this human experience that may look different in different places, I think, how do we see power as something sacred so that we see it as power with each other and not duplicate and become that which we detest and have power over people? So talk to me about, what does it mean as a global majority if we are to then come together in solidarity? How do we then have this collective power, and how do we use it?
Ooh, I love that question. And I know Angelo and Sara are going to wrap this too, because I think her research that she's done is going to really show up here strong. So Sara, I'm going to teeing you up for this next. Here's the thing. I think Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he argues that oppression was so effective that those who are oppressed view power through the lens of oppression. And so they begin to employ oppression because that's how they view power, right? And so we see this show out, play out in varying ways, in power dynamics and power trips, and it's all kind of stuff, right? And so this idea of power itself has been tainted, as toxic, has been manipulated, and so because of that, we tend to think that power is synonymous with oppression because of our experience with power historically. But power is not necessarily oppressive. It's how you employ power.
Correct.
And so I think one of the things that we have to back away from is this idea of being afraid of power. And so I think if we can take, Angelo and I were at a conference recently, and one of the things that we wrestled with is the idea of, we're seeing how hate looks being organized. We're seeing hate being strategized. Just imagine if we organized love. Just imagine if we organized justice. How would power look when it's just? How does power look when it's love rooted, when it's love centered? And so I think we have to back away from the fear of power because of how we have seen it play out in our modern day context, or even in history. But how can love look different? How can power look different rooted in love and being just? And so one, we have to reframe our thinking about power. Power does not have to be oppressive. It can be just.
Yeah.
It can be loving. It can be kind. And so how do we shift our thinking about it, and then we move to reorganize and re-strategize and be collective in our effort, and recognize that we ain't got to have these internal, power struggles
Right.
about who's getting credit, who's name going where, but how do we begin to work together to shift an environment, and culture, and knowing that power is necessary. It's critical, because we cannot do what we need to do in this space if we don't have it.
Correct.
Economically, socially, numerically, intellectually, academically, emotionally, right? We have to have power in these spaces. And so I'm going to pause there and be quiet because I'll keep going.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was a really powerful comment, Pastor D. And what I was thinking about is that theologically, I think we have examples of power that's just, and power that is rooted in love, because it depends on it. I mean, we do have examples of it, but I will say, because there's global religions and there's global narratives about God, and there's global narratives about religion, and interpretations vary from society to society, and sometimes from time to time. So I think we have examples of what power looks like if it's rooted in justice and love. And then we also have competing visions of that, where we have different religions and sometimes even different denominations within the Christian tradition who have interpreted God's action in history, or God's um, not his intervention in history, as being something that is power through love, or the opposite, that it's actually there to help those who are currently in power, to subjugate and oppress others. So I think interpretation matters. I think language matters. And what would be nice is if we could take that theological conversation and actually ground it into our physical reality. And if we had examples, because it is a diverse society, and not everyone's religious, not everyone's theological, not everyone is looking at things through that lens. And I think it's really important to have people who have power in our actual world, in this world, in the physical world, who are using it justly and who are using it in a love-centered way, which is, I think, what we're missing. And so there's a lack of cohesion in society, and run to theology to sort of find that hope. And too often, I think the theological idealism that we have, or that we aspire towards, is just not being seen, witnessed, or experienced in the physical world, which is what Dr. King says at the end of the day, which is that, the universe has a bent towards justice, but we don't see that justice in our everyday reality. So we end up losing faith in God, because we think that, well, God must be unjust. And it's not God who's unjust, it's we don't have a sense of what justice is or how to do it properly.
Before I say anything, Angelo, do you want to add to that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So my identity, so for those that don't know, so I'm Puerto Rican and Indigenous. So kind of like want to take a little bit back when you brought up Ubuntu and the framework, and because I think we also have to kind of like we were saying, like kind of backtrack understanding of history, power, groups, identities, like who played a part, what didn't. And where I'm going with this is that you can even look in the American context of how power was used in an abusive way to dismiss or discredit a certain group that started something. And what I mean by that is, when you look at our Constitution predating that, decades before that, we had what was called the Great Law of Peace by the Haudenosaunee in Northeast America, and that's a native indigenous. It was a unified of seven different tribes, nations coming together, and they had a democratic system. They elected chiefs that were not based on gender. So you would have a woman chieftress, you would have a chief, you would have like these levels of things. And what was happening? You had Benjamin Franklin, you have all these others who were observing this system, and they said, this works. This can actually work. And so what happens is you have these this group of people, you can call them colonizers, you can call them whatever you want, but they had resources, written resources, they had paper, pen type resources, where they can put it on a document and change the narrative and discredit and dismiss the source of their written documents and their inspiration. So that could be, so when we look at power, we can even look at that like that's abusive, that's dismissive, that's discrediting. So what would it look like if we kept that? If we look towards the indigenous to create this democratic society, what would that look like if we had the first 3 presidents to be of indigenous descent, representing tribes and nations? It would be very different because of the gender relations instead of political ideologies and separation and division. It was never based on that. So from that, and then also another example of power abuse, when you look at the U.S.'s influence in other countries, coming from Puerto Rico, when you look at Puerto Rico and went from 1898, went through 400 years of slavery, exploitation, from the Spanish-American War. And then when the U.S. got there, they're like, well, this land is ours, we're not going to let it go. But like in the 1930s, when there was talks about liberation and freedom, independence, by Pedro Albizu Campos, like there was like they banned the Puerto Rican flag. That was one thing. Language was being monitored. English was starting to become the dominant language in schools and public schools. It was like you can't speak Spanish, things like that. But then you have all these exploitative economic stuff. But when you look at that, it's like you have a dominant figure coming into another foreign place, the abuse of power, we're taking control. There was even likeness to savages, wordings of that. And images, it was mimicking the black images of monkeys and things like that. So you see like this propaganda imagery happening. But again, that's a symbol of abuse of power. Instead of saying, let's work together, you have resources, we have resources, and things like that. Now, moving into what you were mentioning earlier with the power with. Perfect example is the Black Panthers. I'm focusing more on the Chicago one, but you have Black Panthers, you have the Young Lords, which is a Puerto Rican group, and the Young Patriots were white Appalachian that moved north. But Fred Hampton was able to organize and remain their identity. You have the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, so we have this power with structure. And he understands that we're not going to fight racism, we'll fight it with unity. And he tackled issues, social issues, healthcare, housing, childcare, and things like that. So there is a liberation even within that, because one of the results was the Young Patriot leader opening in an interview saying we had to learn how to put our racism to the side. So to work together. So there's some liberation movements and things within the movement itself individually, but collectively the power with to occupy churches, to occupy hospitals, to hold them accountable, hold these institutions accountable to their faith, their traditions, to their creeds, and their practices, and to also keep their identity at the same time. And I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about power when you think about power with. Like you can still keep and remain your identity, the fluidity of those identities, but also understand we can do this together. We can tackle these same issues together, and however approach you want to do it, but we can still do it together and mobilize power with. And I'll just end there right there. Yeah.
No, that's good, because you said something. It's going to lead me to my next question, because, you know, we have how I see it, right? There are various forms of power. And one of those that I think one of the most powerful forms of power is narrative power. And so in many ways, we have to reclaim a lot of narratives. And Angelo, you brought that up as you talked about the ways in which, and we can even go back as far as Northeast Africa, right? That we were oral people, oral tradition. So much of what came back to us prepackaged as Greek philosophers, right, was actually African philosophers. And so it's something to the ways that intellectual capital has been stolen. And somewhere here, we have to go back, that Sankofa, right? We have to go back around the globe and reclaim our narratives, because I think that helps us then not only to see the value in other people, but to be able to see, for some people, it's feeling what's not enough and what's empty, which leads to the scarcity mindset. Right, that I have to then mimic the way I see power, because that's how you get power. That's how you maintain power. That's how you get resources, is to use power in a dominating way as opposed to sharing with. So talk to me about, because I don't know how we do this. I think this is something that has to happen globally, like a global movement around reclaiming the narrative of peoples who exist in many places. A God known by many names. I'm going to say, because I'm Christian, so I'm going to talk from that perspective, how as Christians, we are not afraid to be in rooms and sit at tables with people who may not profess a God, or those who profess a God known by many names, where we are not so bound by a Western Eurocentric understanding of what it means to be Christian. And so how do we, as a global majority, I hate using the phrase communities of color, so let's say global majority, how do we begin to build these genuine, authentic relationships so you can have solidarity power that moves us into the other forms of power we can exercise to have a more just and global world? That's the question.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, I'll go first. You know, so yeah, I think one of the things that I think is critical, and I love both Angelo and Sara so much, because we're able to have conversations from different perspectives and experiences, right? And so I think, and then just this week, I was at a conference at the Eradicating Hate Global Summit, and I was in an interfaith session, and I'm in this room of people from literally global, varying faiths. Like I'm literally, with a Buddhist monk who flew from India, across the way from me. There's a Mormon in the room who was a former evangelical. Christians, and Jewish individuals, and Islam is represented. So Hinduism is represented. Sikhism was represented. So it was major, right? So, but I paint that picture for this reason here. One of the ways that we can get to this pace of solidarity and being global is to your point, is to be able to have authentic conversation and have engagement and recognize that we are not the center of the universe. And I really say this to us Christian folk real bad, because we have this idea of Christian supremacy and born out of that, we have this mindset that we have to go into the world and convert everybody. And we do that, through, dominionism and, being oppressive and being, all the things that go along with that. And so, but if we just step back, if we're in this room and globally, I'm seeing how God has showed up in different spaces, in different languages and cultures and creeds, and known by other names.
Yeah.
I recognize that God ain't this big. God is God. So who am I to put God in my little box? And so I think we got to, begin with this conversation that, just because I experience God this way,
Right.
does not mean the rest of the globe experiences God the same way. And it's okay. It's really okay. And so I think we begin by having exposure and honest, authentic, loving engagement, and recognize that I can learn from you. I learned a whole lot from again, this guy was a medical doctor who gave up his study and practice to become a Buddhist monk and left and went to India. Because he recognized how detrimental he was being in healthcare.
Wow. That's saying a whole lot.
So he gave it up. But again, we can learn a lot. And so I think, and again, that's why I mentioned earlier, I love Angelo and Sara so much, because we can have conversations and I can learn from them. I can learn from, Angelo. Again, I've never met anybody who was both Indigenous.
Right.
I've never seen that combination in my life. That was like, cool. You're my guy, but then, Sara, Islam and Christianity from Pakistan. Come on now. And then the work that she has done to study, it's like I can learn from that.
Yeah.
Right. And so it helps me see the globe in a very different way. So I'm gonna be quiet. You'll be all right.
I want to, because you brought this up, and I think just practical ways. So you gave a very real lived experience, right, of what it means to be in a pluralistic room. And I can remember, I don't know if I was in Haiti or if I was in, I don't know where I was, but I was somewhere outside the U.S. And I remember running into a woman and having a language barrier, but still was able to have a conversation through a translator. And I remember walking away saying, I don't know what that woman believes in, but you can't tell me she doesn't know God. Right? And I think, so part of this is also, you can't travel to these other countries, open up a book. Find a documentary, that we have to begin to be comfortable with seeing something outside of American context, right? And vice versa. Others have to look more, and I even talk about, even for us as Black folk in America, see, we have a lot more work to do, because we're trying to even reclaim not what was lost, because a lot of it still is with us, what came across, during our Mayafa, and how we even need to reclaim that before we can go out and hear somebody else's story. We have to reclaim our own story first, because many of us don't know what that is. And I think that's why we started that conversation with the diasporic conversation last week before we now jump to now let's talk about this global majority. Because we first have to come into the space knowing fully who we are and comfortable with who we are, rooted in. Like Angelo sounds, having talked to him many times because being a fellow at the King Center, he's clearly rooted in his identity.
Yeah.
And that's critical. You have to know who you are before you can really go out and meet here. Because other than that, I'm going to feel like I'm not enough. You're telling your story, I'm thinking, well, maybe I don't belong in this space, or I don't know. And I may react to that in very different ways that could be harmful to how we're trying to have solidarity. So I just wanted to also put that extra layer in that for a lot of us. We have to know who we are before we can even move into the global conversation. So Dr. Singha, Angelo, how you want to add, or did you go first?
I did.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, but just to push back on that a little bit, the issue I think seems to be lack of education, which is widespread globally. And so you can have people who are very strongly rooted in their identity, but sometimes their identity is actually based in or mired in misinformation. People don't actually know their history. They don't know what happened to them. Many subjugated communities, persecuted communities, marginalized communities all over the globe have had their voices stolen, have had their history stolen. Those histories were told many years later by dominant voices, not necessarily white, because I'm thinking about India, for example, where the untouchables have been subjugated. And it's something that mirrors what happened to the Black community in the United States, where the slave experiences have been mistold, or they've been retold, and it was dominated by white voices for a long time, and that happened in India. But the races weren't exactly different. I mean, it was still domination and power, but it was done by Brahmanical, from the priestly class, and it was still the same culture and still the same race. So I think that narratives do have power, and a lot of narratives and histories are rooted in absolute misinformation because people have lack of education. And they're clinging to sort of ideals and fantasies that they have about who God is, who God isn't, and then, what community is, who people are, what people mean, how people should function. And all of that is based in a lot of lack of education. And something that Pastor D and I talk about often is how undereducated the Christian community is at large, just globally. We want to look at biblical literalism. We want to take it for granted. We want to say that this is the truth, even though historical studies and historical analysis of biblical texts are available to everyone, everywhere, and people just don't take the time to read them. And then, you just keep believing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. At the same time, there are communities who have had really horrible experiences in life with actual subjugation, actual oppression, actual marginalization and persecution, who have justified reasons for feeling betrayed by God, abandoned by God, because that is their life experience. And we're not going to say that they're not Christian or they're not Muslim, they're not Hindu. There are people who have just been abandoned and disappointed by life. And if they've been praying to God and God hasn't helped them, then they have every right to feel abandoned by God. So dominant voices don't always have the same experiences as subjugated, persecuted peoples and communities. And so they cannot really adequately understand what those communities are going through and why some of those communities reject God or reject spirituality or theology altogether. And then they look to social justice and physical realities. And sometimes those let people down. And so I think we really have to start at the forefront of changing our education, changing our way of engaging what's happening with ourselves, also with other people, what's happening with our community, other communities, and ways in which we can help them in very tangible ways. Because at some point, if we don't impact public policy, we're not actually going to change anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thank you for that pushback. And I wanted just to clarify what I was saying more specifically around Black people born in America, that we don't know who we are. We're disconnected from our roots, and that we have to do the work of not allowing I don't even think we have a functioning education system. So I'm not even looking to that being the place in which we learn about who we are, but we have to take ownership of that. We have to make sure that we are claiming the right narrative about who we are, where we came from, and then what also survived the Great Travail. Because I believe there are some things that survived that we lean into So I was talking about how we can do that before we can even think about. That's just me. How my and that's because we work with people every day in community.
Yeah. But
They just don't know. Just they believe what has been said. I think about James Baldwin when he talks about his father, when he said it wasn't until he was older that he understood his father better, because they had a very tenuous relationship. And he said, what was wrong with my father was deep down he believed what white people said about him. And I'm saying that for a lot of people here in America who are black folks living here, it's so internalized. And also to your point, Dr. Singha, it's that thing I've been down so long, right? That what you mean? You tell me about this guy that you want to talk to me about. I don't believe that, because I see what I deal with every single day down here in South Dallas.
Right.
Or if I'm over, just 30 miles outside of Dallas, I have no running water, right? But I do think for us that is a place where we have to definitely start, because I see the struggle. And Pastor D, you probably know this when we're trying to do justice work. It's hard to get people to connect to it because of, one, lack of knowledge, and also lack of knowing who you are, knowing you deserve, that this is not how it has to be.
Right.
And that we have to engage, and that we have to look at the systems and institutions that are shaped and framed through policy and law. And how do we enter into those spaces? So yes, but thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right. Just, in terms of, you can know who you are, but your mimic, it's really like Renee Girard, right? That we engage in mimicry oftentimes. We become that which we detest, or we try to take on the persona of that very culture that dehumanized and stripped us of our language, history, and culture. Angelo, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think what everyone has shared so far is this understanding of power and how power is functioning, the power of narrative, the power of a dominant narrative, what comes with that, dismissive, discredit, completely canceling, deleting, and then also the power to reclaim, and the power within reclaiming an identity and the journey of it. You hear so many stories, people are like, whether it's from ancestry, documenting ancestry, or it's like, hey, passed down traditions. This is a liberating, expression of my, my power, and there's things that, there's power found within it. So I think even in that space, there's power in reclaiming, and that could be free, be like, hey, my background was a very conservative, strict, religious background, but if I dive into the complexity of all that, this person married this into this family, but they were practicing this and they were condemned. They were never talked about at the dinner table. But it's like, why was that? What was making them, push back and all these things? Why were they not talked about? And then when you start diving into these things, like, wow, practices were different in this area or in this time period. So it kind of gives us a sense of like, there is a spectrum. There is this sense of freedom of how to express, how to practice. And you were sharing, like, in the Black narrative, like, especially in the US context, like, there's always power within. And when we specifically talk about culture, people think about the elements, the food, the music, the movement, the thinking, the contributors to, whether it's inventions, the patents. Like, there's so many Black inventors, patents that we don't even discuss, that impacts us on a day-to-day basis. And so I think even in that space of like reclaiming that, like, we are a people of inventions, progressive movements, economic stability, things like that. And then resisting the narrative, resisting the dominant narrative. Even here in Georgia, you have it's a famous, well, I would say it's infamous locally. If you visit, you probably hear about Lake Lanier. The original city was called Oscarville. Thriving Black community, small, U.S. Marine Corps played a part in removing that intentionally and building a lake, which provides the water for Georgia. So we think that we're all benefiting from this deletion, I would call it, but like just deteriorating a Black community, and for the sake of others. And the same thing when you look at the interstate where it was built,
Right,
intentionally
correct.
built in Black communities. So there's been this huge, every era, everything, like we're progressing, but we're also, we're losing it in a sense of a systematic view. But in the resistance, there's power. This reclaiming of, we can still move, we can still breathe, we can still do. And then what does that look like on a collective front? Since I know it's one of the main overall topics of this, but what does that look like on a collective front, on a collective power? And to move forward, but reclaim that. Like, the power, the definition is the ability to physically act and do,
Correct.
and mentally do, physically and mentally do. So when you think about that, and the history that comes with that within your communities, there's a sense of resistance, but healing and reclaiming, as it was echoed before. But yeah, that's what was on my mind when everyone was
Yes.
sharing.
Yeah,
So,
thank you for that. And so our hour is well spent, but what I want to take an opportunity to do, because we have so many scholars here, I want each person tell folks where they can maybe find your scholarship, where they can read, where they can become more informed. I think that's also helpful beyond this moment. So anybody can kind of start, but just where can people find your scholarship, or what you recommend people read to be more informed?
All right. Well, I guess I'll go first again. A couple of things. I really recommend, in terms of reading material. Wow, that's a list in my head. I'm gonna go with Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Okay.
Paulo Freire. I think that everyone should read that book, because I think it gives you a good picture of what you're wrestling with and trying to navigate the mindset reframing and restructuring that we have to kind of go through in this work and that we're doing in this space. Because a lot of damage has been done mentally.
Yes.
To people groups, right? So I'll say that. How can you find me? Well, here it is. Y'all know me. I'm highlight the Better Together program at the King Center. Is our interfaith initiative that's designed to empower the faith space with tools and resources to do the work we do in social change work. Using your faith lens and, of course, Kingian nonviolence. And so go over to thekingcenter.org, Better Together, and we are right there. And we would love to have you engage in the faith space. Aside from that, of course, we have the Conscious Conversations podcast. I'm there as well. And, of course, I'm Pastor D here in Dallas at The Life. So, yeah, there's that.
All right.
Okay, I guess I'll jump in. I also work at the King Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and I run the fellowship and internship programs there. So, of course, you can visit our website and look under research, education, and programs, or under programs, and look at our internship and fellowship program. We are just about to start our fall program, which it started actually 2 days ago, but we officially start on Monday. So if you're interested, we have wonderful academic internships and fellowships for undergraduate students, master's level students, and also some senior scholars or people who have worked in the social justice field for several years. And the fellowship and internship program are focused on Dr. King, his legacy, and public life. So there's that. In terms of things that people should read, I really think a worthwhile read for everyone is God of the Oppressed by James Cone. I think that's a really, really helpful book that helps people understand what marginalized and persecuted communities are going through. I think he has an amazing methodology and theory that one can apply to different communities globally. And I think it's written in a very, very easy to understand way. Although he's a fantastic scholar, I think he writes for the everyday layperson, and he really lays out narratives, the power of narratives, the power of history, the power of the dominant societal, dominant societal institutions, actually, and how they function, and how things like theology and the story of the oppressed is extremely important in shaping how people think about themselves and how people think about others, and how they address certain issues that are occurring around them. So I would highly recommend that book. And Dr. Ayers, of course, this has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for being so welcoming and for always inviting us to have these amazing dialogues with you. Thank you.
Oh, yes, of course, of course. Angelo.
Yeah, at the King Center also, in multiple roles. But you can find me like mainly on LinkedIn. I've kind of pushed away from all the other social media outlets, but LinkedIn main space and two books that come to my mind. One is called War Against All Puerto Ricans: The Revolution and Terror in America's Colony. And it's a good, well-documented book, talking about how the Spanish American War under the American, the Spaniard colonization to America's colonization, but how does that contribute to the larger picture, when we think about the Caribbean, um, just like migration coming to the States, and what does that look like today? And then also from the Indigenous point of view, it's a book called The Land Is Not Empty. Just following Jesus and dismantling the doctrine and discovery. And so post-colonial, look at things and understanding what does this look like for Indigenous and other groups when we tackle, especially if you're of the Christian faith tradition. What does this look like? And what do we know from our education? We brought up education earlier. So what do we know about our education, and how it challenges us? So that's from an Indigenous point of view, and then also from a Puerto Rican point of view too. So yeah, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to share the space with everyone as we discuss this. So yeah.
Thank you for that. I just think in the age of erasure, and banning books and burning books, it's important that we read all that we can, where we can get what we can get our hands on. So let's give it up for Dr. Singha, for Angelo, and for Pastor D being on Fannie's Classroom today. We thank you so much. And so, Dr. Singha, Angelo, you'll be getting a nice little package in the mail coming to you sooner than later. As our token, just a small token of our gratitude of you taking time out to be with us on today. So we're excited about next week's episode. So again, we kind of started the season off kind of looking at joy as a witness, so we don't lose what we have internally as we deal with all this around us. And I thought it was important that we look beyond just as being Black in America, but how we connect to our roots and see the many ways that Blackness has developed and grew into its own unique cultures in different places. But we from the same roots, but Blackness looks different in different places. But how we bring that together, and then I wanted to expand that out to how we have global solidarity with the global majority. And so next week, I'm going to drill it all the way down to the micro level. And we're going to have an amazing conversation. Pastor D will be back again next week because he started this conversation maybe 3 seasons ago, or maybe it was the first season. We're going to have this thing called Band Together and Build the Village. And so we're going to talk about what are some ways that we do return to some African ways of knowing that can be beneficial, that we might be better here locally down to the very basic level. Going back to things like appositional unity, understanding what that means and how we get away from this patriarchal, hierarchical way of understanding what it means to be in a relationship with one another. So I'm super excited about that conversation. We kicked it off again some seasons ago, but we're going to bring it back around again, and we're going to have Pastor Magruder come back, because I think it was you, me, Pastor Magruder, and going to bring in Reverend Stacey Brown, who will be another strong voice in the room. So super excited about next week. So make sure you tune in next week at 12 o'clock noon right here in the classroom. The only announcement that I have, here we do a lot to connect with our students. Many of them need a lot before they even show up to school. And we try to do what we can to support the Haynes Global Prep Academy located on the campus of Paul Quinn College. And so you have an opportunity to support them with school supplies, uniforms. What else, Cheryl? Personal hygiene items. So we also, every Christmas, holiday, I say holiday because everybody doesn't do Christmas, we do holiday. We try to really give them some of their first wishes for the holiday season. So what you see on the screen, you can scan the QR code. You can also always go to the Friendship West website and make a donation. Everything we bring in goes back out. And we also support the families, because oftentimes the family have needs, and we want to support the family as well. So it's an amazing program what we do called I Care. It helps with all of those things. And we support the administrators and the teachers down to the custodians. We also are a blessing to them as well. So that's the only announcement I have this week. So make sure you make your contributions. And so next week, though, get ready. We're going to drop some new paraphernalia, some new merchandise for you. So look forward to that, because that's the way you help us support the classroom, where we can continue to bring amazing guests on, so we can have these conversations at what I call the intersection of faith, politics, gender, and race that we need to have on a consistent basis. So thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing you next week right here in Fannie Lou's classroom.
From the church